Chapter 3 is really another look at the historical perspectives. And instead of trying to report history, they're trying to commentate and think about it in Chapter 3. It got a little bit long, but I think it's more interesting than the last chapter, and you'll find it. I'm sorry I get off again. I get carried away. I get kind of whiny and complainy, and I think it has to do with something with my age or something. But if you'll just stick with me, Chapter 3 is more enjoyable. Chapter 3, Historical Perspectives of Education. Perspectives of the same authors that in the Chapter 2 they took you through the history. Chapter 3, the perspectives of it, and they give you some prelims for that. Okay, more students, bigger schools, and that's the prelim for it. And growth, phenomenal change. Here, let's take out here rapid growth in size and complexity of schools, and that's not profound to you. Demand expectation placed on schools by the information age. We have that last chapter. Trying to provide equal educationals for all students has been a challenge and practical value of history of education, and they try and walk all the way around this practical application. So more students, rapid growth, more school of need for schools, need for teachers, school district consolidation, busing, bigger school budgets, curricular, growth education programs. And so I have those here, and this will be your number one here, each of these. Number one, you're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. And you're going to have a one-line tag for each of those from the textbook. And you bring that over here, and again, make those red for me so I can find them. First of all, the enrollment growth. I've highlighted some stuff here. Let me get this up where you can see better. As the sheer size, the total number of public school students in the United States has about doubled during this time in the last half century. So bring that in about enrollment growth. This nearly doubled. Although part of it's attributed to overall population growth, more of it was the fact that more people go to school. The compensatory attendance laws, just as we found last chapter in South Dakota, the compensatory attendance changed in South Dakota in 2009 from 16 to the age 18. That added more people to the school rolls. Not a significant amount, but enough that they had to plan for those additional students in the school, and that's across the country. And you think in the last half century, those compensatory laws really kept increasing. For the more they stayed in school, you know that my dad's time, an 8th grade education was considered a good, solid education. And now, of course, that would be considered a very poor education. And with that, need for more schools, and again, we're jumping right here. Need for more schools. Many schools had to resort to temporary mobile classrooms. Okay, and it gives you a whole plethora of stuff here that they did to placate not having enough room in the schools as the schools grew. Other strategies to cope with the classroom shortage, including larger classes, split scheduling, very early in the day and late in the day, classes held in makeshift areas, the gym, hallways, storage closets. Many schools also rented additional space in nearby buildings. Fortunately, over time, taxpayers were generally willing to take care of this. I observed a student teacher one time that taught her class in the library while the library was functioning because there wasn't enough class space. You've seen lots of mobile classrooms around in South Dakota. My wife's cousins in Chicago, they're older than I am now, but when they were in school, they moved to a new suburb of Chicago. And at that time, there was such rapid growth there, they did the split schedule. They did the split schedule where you either had the morning school or afternoon, 7 to noon, or from like noon till 5 or 6. And that's how they did it. And they built all kinds of elementary schools. And then, as you can imagine, that suburb landlocked, couldn't grow anymore, and the kids went through the school system. And then by the time I knew this family 30 years ago, met them 30 years ago, they were in the process of trying to figure out what to do with all these school buildings. They'd built so many schools to take care of the needs of the students then that as you can imagine, those kids all moved through school. The family stayed in the suburb because it was such a nice suburb, and suddenly they had elementary buildings sitting empty. And at that time, I've lost track of it now, but in about 1990, they had sold 2 of the 3 elementary buildings, closed the middle school, moved the middle school kids to the high school, instead still had half the high school building unused, just because they got landlocked. And I wonder sometimes in our communities around here if that's happening, that we're building so fast that the day comes where we don't need that much school building. And that'd be a real challenge as a planner of some of our rapidly growing school districts is, will this ever end? Will we landlocked where we have buildings we don't need? But that's going to be our first discussion for this. First discussion is about that for you, and everybody respond to this. I'm going to just call it makeshift classrooms. Okay, I just said, did you ever attend a makeshift classroom due to space issues? Explain. And again, once you have responded, please mark that. Please mark that in here so we have it. I'm just going to put a widget down here for you, discussion area, so that we have that. There it is, makeshift classroom. Okay, that's one. There'll be others, and then I say mark that please on your notes that you've done that. And I'm going to say this is just put a little discussion here. All right. Now the need for more teachers. Naturally, this surge in student enrollment required many additional teachers. To alleviate this, and this is what the problem, bring this in your notes, that states lowered their certification requirements because there wasn't enough teachers. So they lowered their certification requirements to sometimes the point there was no requirement because they couldn't get teachers. And now, as cruel and horrible as that sounds, but here's your choices. Your choices are lower your requirements or not have anybody, not have teachers. And so that's what drove that, and that at the time was a good decision. This also more of everything was required to provide education to the budgeting school population. So if you needed more schools, more teachers, you also needed more buses, more cooks, more books, more desks, more space, more playground, more parking. And what's interesting about this discussion, you look at around rural South Dakota, of the number of schools that have the opposite problem, that they're shrinking so fast. And why are they shrinking? Why are our rural schools shrinking? I'm going to ask you to do that here also, under more teachers. Why are our rural schools shrinking? So this will be number 2, this will be number 3. You're still going down this list here. Why are the rural schools shrinking in South Dakota? Why are they closing? Where are the kids going? School district consolidation of school districts is another noble administrative trend. During the past 75 years, the number of separate school districts have reduced. And this is what I want you to bring in here, this reduction from 117,000 districts in 1940 to 14,000 today. And I'm not even going to guess the percentage drop that is, but from 117,000 to 40. And there's a corresponding decline in the number of one-teacher schools over this time. And really, that's what drives that. I did a little search here on one-room schools, I'm just going to do this like a one-room school. And this is the way our country started, was one-room schools. And for the most part, as we studied the history of this, and here's some nice looks at one-room schools, and some of our TV programs, Little House on the Prairie and the Waltons and some of those old syndicated movies gave you somewhat of a glimpse of this. And that is that they were across ages in that community. Now here's some stuff that's not in the text, but let me give you the basics of this. Each township, and I know this is South Dakota law in most of the rural areas, each township, and a township is 8 miles by 8 miles, each township was required to have a school. That school was considered a school district. Let me just I'll put that on there and see if I can find something with that. But each township, like here's a township school. So they were small. This represents a reunion of those townships. My wife's country school, she attended country school till she completed the 3rd grade before they went to what was called then town school. And at that time, they closed that rural school. And that dissolved that school district. So that's a large part of this shrinkage from 117,000 to 14,000. Now, I could do a whole thing, get carried away about the equity of the size of our schools. That my sons will go to a high school with 24 or 2,500 kids, and many of us went to a high school with less than 100. Less than 100. And with that, where's the equity in that? And you don't hear about that. The equity is these small schools and closing them, but is there any equity? Is there any reason that my kid has to go to a school of 2,500? Now, I know. I had somebody right in our hallway, right down the hall from me, 2 doors, say, well, why don't you move to a smaller school if you don't like it? Can't do that. That would be separate but equal. Can't be separate. That's what we said to the black kids. That's what we said to the poor kids. Move. Go someplace else. We don't have to offer you an equal opportunity. We don't have to offer you as good an opportunity. What I'm questioning is it as valuable, is the education as valuable in a building with 2,500 as this 100? Is that equal? Is that fair? I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but I know it's dramatically different attending a school with 2,500 kids or 100, a high school. Good and bad about both, and that's another discussion another day. But consolidation of these small township schools is the most what drove this. Then the growth of busing is estimated that about 60% of all students are bused to school. About 450 school buses, 450,000 school buses, and I'm going to ask that as another one here, and that is to tell about your experiences being bused. All right, and say riding the bus. Or not riding. Okay, I said related experience about riding the bus to school or not riding. That's your second thing here. All right. And I'm going to take you back here and say that's number 4. Okay. And the thing that, again, is interesting here is that they don't talk about the real busing. And that's this again. I want to talk briefly about called forced busing. And this was part of the desegregation process in the 70s. And I don't know, again, it doesn't fit these authors' narrative to tell this story, but in the 70s, they said to students, get on the bus and go to another school. And what they were doing is trying to just segregate some schools, because what would happen, as in today, that the small, the downtown areas often had the poorer kids and often the minority kids, and the more affluent kids, the more affluent families would move to the suburbs to attend better schools. And some of the bright people of the time said, gee, this isn't fair. We've got to have kids integrated. So they would come into these white schools, into these more affluent schools, and force some of the kids to get on the bus and ride as much as an hour downtown. And then they'd pick up those kids from the downtown area and make them ride that hour back and be in the suburban schools. And that went on about 10 years, and you can see the riots. And that was the thing, is families moved. I mean, they moved completely out of state to get away from this, but it was just so interesting that powers to be said, gee, we've got to integrate kids. And no, the kids didn't want this. Neither side wanted this. It was driven by a small group of people that got power, and still, in my opinion, still in power in the schools. But it's so interesting that these authors, in their narrative here, don't even describe that time, because I'm sure they would have been once endorsing that. But it's being dropped from the history books, but thank goodness for Google. Some images, but that's what it was. It was a horrible time where they forced kids to attend schools that weren't in their neighborhood in the name of desegregation. And don't call me a racist, but I don't think Martin Luther King would have been for this. Martin Luther King wasn't for desegregation. Martin Luther King was equal opportunity for everybody. He knew birds of a feather wanted to flock together. But this would have broke his heart. You got to remember, he was killed in the 60s, was assassinated in the 60s. This was the 70s in the name of desegregation, and people lost their lives, and there was just strife in our country because a few smart people decided that kids needed to go to school someplace other than their neighborhood schools. So let's move on to bigger school budgets. And again, it tries to give you a scenario here of the growth. It says $5 billion, $2 billion in this country in 40, 5 and 50, $15 billion in 60, $40 billion in 70, $97 billion in 80, and $208 billion in 90. And I'm sure it's doubled now. It's 23 years later. I'm sure it's more than doubled again. Even the figures are for inflation. The percentage by gross domestic is 3.5% of our gross domestic product was spent in 40, and now it's 7 and 80. And so, of course, with that huge budget growth, and you can bring some of that into your part here about bigger budgets. And then the rapid growth and curricular changes. I just jumped down here in 58, shortly after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Congress passed the National Defense Act. And what I'm going to ask you to do is put a little bit here about Sputnik. Sputnik was significant in schools, and so I want you to do a little link here, a little research on Sputnik, and not so much what it was, but what was its effect on schools, on the public schools. So you may want to Google it by putting Sputnik, public schools, and see what it says. But Sputnik had a dramatic thing. One, we immediately passed this Congress National Defense Education Act law, and so put that in here also. But this will be number 5. Here is what is Sputnik, and put a little link to where you found the information. Bring a couple sentences. Remember, I showed you how to link something. Do you want me to show you again? Here's a quick lesson on it. So here you're in Sputnik, and you're finding something, and you've got your information in here, so you block it. We call that blocking it. And then come here under Insert, and yours may be a little different, but nonetheless will be somewhat the same. You go to Insert here, and here's the thing called Hyperlink. Come up like this, and you drop your URL. You paste your URL from wherever you found that in here. And I can grab one here like this. So if I want this here, I copy this URL, and I come back to this paper here, and I drop that in there. I drop this in here like this, and now that's hyperlinked. But Sputnik had a profound effect, got everybody nervous, excited, made the feds get involved, took some action here. And it brought this NDEA, and there's a question on the test about NDEA, so please be familiar with what that is, what it stands for. It's significant. What is the significance of it to our conversation here? And then the growth of special education programs, number one was 94-142, and that's what you want to bring in your notes, is the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. And if you've had an Intro to SPED course, the SPED 100 course, certainly you know what that is, but it was the first real sweeping federal piece of legislation that had this to say, all kids were entitled to a free and appropriate public education, a FAPE, free appropriate public education regardless of disability, because at the time we still had a sector of students that were severely disabled that we'd said couldn't be in our schools, and rather than try and define who could be and who couldn't be, 94-142, and they've had to update it a bunch of times, put more teeth in it because schools wouldn't comply, but to the point now where this is the law of the land that all students are entitled to a free, appropriate public education, a FAPE, and you can put that acronym in your notes if you want, FAPE, but 94-142. This will be a little sidebar that I like to put in here, but you tell me in your notes here, what does that, all the stuff I gave you, and we're going to make this number 6, but what does 94 and 142 stand for? The number 94 and 142. A little history lesson, a little government lesson there for you. All right. And let's move on. More changes, challenges, and perspectives. First of all, and this is really interesting, and this is the one I want to push on a little bit. You can disagree, and that's great, but the increasing involvement of the federal government, and if I'll allow me to read, I want to spew this a little bit, as shown in the Education and News feature at the beginning of this chapter. Our federal government has played an increasingly important role in education over the years, and why I'm a copying attitude about that is there's absolutely no provision whatsoever in the Constitution about education, that the education was to be exclusively to the states, hence the term United States. But Sputnik was the first real kickoff of it, and from then on to this day, the federal government is almost taken exclusive control of our schools. And the most recent one that's not mentioned in this discussion is Common Core Standards. That is a takeover by the feds, by the federal government. So if you allow me to read, I'm right here. Policymakers at federal level have provided funds for specific education programs and have passed many laws and regulations pertaining to schools. Presidents have created programs and regulations affecting schools. The federal courts have handed down decisions and have had great ramifications for our schools, and a variety of federal agencies have created programs and regulations from our schools. So from the top down, we have given away the control of our schools. And what do we get out of it? We get money, and we're like prostitutes. If someone will give us money, we will gladly give control of our schools, control away. So in the 1940s, the nation saw the nation at war, which provided an impetus for the federal government to pass numbers of laws that affected education. One was, and it was huge, the Vocational Education for National Defense Act. It was a crash program to prepare workers needed in industry and produce goods for the national defense. So that's what I highlighted there. You'll want to bring that into your notes here under increasing federal involvement. And we're up to number 7 here. And with that, you're going to say something about each of these: National Science Foundation and categorical aid in the GI Bill. Okay. If you allow me to keep reading here, the program operated through state educational agencies and trained more than 7 million workers. In 1941, the Laham Act provided funds for building, maintaining and operating community facilities in areas where local communities had unusual burdens because of defense and war initiatives. And this was the foothold. It was wartime. And so they gave money specifically to do things that were needed. Okay, just remember that. That's the genesis. That's the beginning to where it grew today. First, the GI Bill. The federal government recognized the need to help young people whose careers had been interrupted by military services. And I want you to put that in your notes. This is what the GI Bill was for. To help people whose careers had been interrupted. The GI Bill of 1944 provided for the education of veterans in World War II. Later, similar bills assisted veterans of the Korean conflict. These federal acts afforded education to more than 10 million veterans at a cost of $20 billion. Payments were made directly to veterans and to the colleges and schools and veterans attended. In 1966, another GI Bill was passed for veterans of Vietnam. The initial cost of these amounted to a wonderful national investment because the government was repaid many times over by increased tax revenue, eventually paid by veterans. Okay, so they're justifying their involvement that it generated money, and you could make that case. And it is alive and well today. I have a nephew that was just out of the military for the first time in our history. The drawdown of our troops is not voluntary. He had 10 years in and did not want to leave, and they said, we're letting people go. And so he's out, but he has GI Bill money to go spend now to go to school. Okay, National Science Foundation is another one now for your notes. Established in 1950, the need for continued support for basic scientific research was created to promote a progress of science, advance national health, prosperity, welfare, secure the national defense. Again, there's a question about that, the National Science Foundation. And this is the big one. This is the one I think is where we have now given it all away in the name of federal aid in dollars. Categorical federal aid. Beginning in 1957, when the first Soviet space vehicle launched, the federal government further increased participation in education. So the big first step in their increase, and of course with that, it was shortly after that we got prayer out of our schools and stuff because the feds got involved. The NDEA, Vocational Education Act of 63, Manpower Development Training Act of 62, Element Ed Act of 65, International Education Act of 66, all of these were federal acts to take control of schools. And then it came down here, and here's what you'll want to also put in your notes. Project Head Start, National Teacher Corps, Upward Bound are further indications of such participation. All these acts and programs have involved categorical federal aid to education, meaning if you would do what they say, you can have the money. And of course, you know how we are as schools and educators. We all say, oh yes, if you'll give us money, we'll do whatever you say, Master. We'll do whatever you say. And we did. And to the point we're addicts now that we can't live without that pipeline of categorical federal aid. Okay, some people believe that federal influence in education has recently been greater than either state or local influence. And again, I resent this thing of some people. No, anybody that's paying attention knows that we no longer have control at the local level. We've given control through Common Core, No Child Left Behind, 94-142, all those pieces of legislation mentioned up here to the federal government. And again, I say to you, there is no mention in the Constitution as the responsibilities of our federal government to do anything with education. That's left exclusively to the states. And it's not left or right. It's all, many presidents on both sides have signed pieces of legislation taking control of schools, of our schools, when they really have no constitutional authority to do so. There can be no denying that through federal legislation, U.S. Supreme Court decisions, federal administrative influence, and total federal effect on education is indeed great. And they're not poo-pooing this. They're agreeing this. They're for this, but these authors support this, but they're not denying that it's happened. Indication are that this effect will even be more pronounced in the future. And again, I'm glad that these very opinionated people at least will acknowledge that we're going to give more control to the feds. And why? Money. If they give us money, we'll do whatever they say. We'll take prayer out, we'll take soda out, we'll change our lunch programs, we'll change the day, we'll change the curriculum, whatever the feds tell us, as long as the money keeps coming. We remain for historians to determine whether this trend in U.S. education is a beneficial one. And thank you for them to acknowledge that. That will remain for historians to determine whether this trend in U.S. education is a beneficial one. And that is giving control to the feds. I didn't mean to get that cranked up about it, but I did. The struggle for equal educational opportunity has characterized struggle for equal educational opportunity for all. Here, the African-American activism. The struggle was initiated by African-American activism movement and given momentum by women's rights groups, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and other chapters deal with it. And so this was all done by community organizers, and that was their job to promote this equal opportunity. And what's interesting, again, they don't mention here that a lot of these schools that are mentioned that the community organizers went after are get more federal and state dollars per student than the more affluent area ones. And so it's so interesting to say that we haven't provided the opportunities. We have at least provided the dollars. If dollars was the answer, this would have been solved years ago. And if you want to see that dollars aren't, it mentions Native Americans here for the first time, go look at our reservation schools who get more dollars per student than anybody else in the state, and see what their achievements and stuff are, their achievement scores and their graduation rates. So it's my contention, and contrary to what the authors of the book say, that money does not fix this. Money does not fix this. Oh, what fixes it? That's a whole nother class. Then No Child Left Behind, and again I'm bringing it over here. Equal opportunities. This is number 8 and number 9, and you're going to make some notes about both of these. Federal government's recent major effects to improve education to help children. And this is so interesting because as we look at here, they're very accepting and complimentary of these other steps in the federal government's involved. But look at this one. The No Child Left Behind, it says the most recent major effort to improve education and help children, especially disadvantaged children, sweeping legislation commonly referred to No Child Left Behind, NLBC, which the goal of the law is admirable but has been widely criticized. And then they go on to list the criticisms. I don't understand that they list all the pro parts of all these up here. They're fine, but this piece here, they say it had admirable goals. The law has it was admirable goals. But here's the reasons it's been criticized. Well, tell us what was, please, don't show your colors here. Tell us what the admirable goals, what were the goals? What was the positives? What's been the good? And what I want you to do is bring this out here is what it was. And then recent changes to this law allow states to opt out. So this is what the current administration said when they ran, that they would, first thing they would do is overturn this from the last administration. But in essence, what they did, like so many laws, they just told which states they didn't have to comply. South Dakota is still bound to this law and its requirements, but 29 states, right here, 29 states have chosen not to do so. No, the feds had to allow them to not do so. But so interesting, their take on this, that they're not giving you the strength of this. That bothers me that these folks would author a book and be that biased, that one-sided on things. But that's their theme throughout the book. It fits their narrative, so it's all good except this piece here. And they don't, I don't know, they lose their credibility by doing it that way. Okay, that's number 9. We're going on to changes, challenges, perspective, professionalization of teaching. And this has been pretty widely discussed with you. Formal teacher training is a relatively recent phenomenon. Teacher training programs were developed during the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th. Continue to refine it. And here's what I want you to talk about this, like the things that were refined. all facets of education. And here, this will be your, we're up to number 10, are these things that were refined: curriculum, teaching methodology, training of school service personnel, administrators, counselors, librarians, media, and specialists, in-service teacher training, teacher organizations, and even school building construction. Those are the way it's been professionalized in that. Okay. Put in number 10. Moving on, continuance importance of private schools. If you allow me to read, nearly all early schools in colonial America were private, and religion was the main purpose of education. Boy, have we abandoned that. Children were taught to read primarily so that they could study the Bible, or in essence read the Bible, and most early colleges were private, established primarily to train ministers. Okay, so we talked about that last chapter. That was the parameter of education. The old deluder law, the old Satan deluder law is so that you could enter God's heaven by being learned in the Bible. And as the public school systems developed, however, the religious nature of education gradually diminished to the point of relatively few U.S. children attend religious schools. And that's not too relatively few is not a fair statement. There has always been certain religious groups, however, who have labored to create and maintain their own private schools so that religious instruction could permeate all areas of curriculum. The most notable of these religious groups have been the Roman Catholic Church. During the past 25 years, though, enrollment in non-Catholic religious schools has grown dramatically, whereas Catholic school enrollment has declined. In other words, the other denominations, and a lot of, as I told you, my kids went to an elementary school that was was Christian education, and it was known as a non-denominational. And I know we had several Catholic kids that attended there, were classmates with my boys. So there have the others, other than the Catholics, caught on. The Catholic school, there's no doubt, in my dad's time, he went to school in the 50s, just about every community had a Catholic school. And some of you from small communities, ask your parents, will tell you, oh yeah, there used to be a Catholic school. And they're all gone away. Despite the recent trend, the Roman Catholic Diocese operate extremely large school systems, sometimes larger than the public school system in some areas. One example, Chicago Archdiocese, which operates the largest Roman Catholic school in the United States. And so maybe that's one thing you bring in your notes here. The one in Chicago has the largest Roman Catholic school. That would be here, number 11. And this will be number 12. I'll get to that in a second. With rare exceptions, private and parochial schools struggle to raise the funds they need to exist. Typically must charge tuition fee, yes, a large one, rely on private contributions, and conduct various fundraising activities. And also my kids went to private school. We never stopped selling candy bars and cookie dough and things and raising money, only to find my kids in public school now, it's no different. We never get done selling stuff either. In recent years, some school districts have made tuition vouchers available to parents who choose not to send their children to public schools to take their money with them. And again, that is a whole other thing that they skip over here, and that is the voucher system. Tuition fee. In recent years, some school districts have made tuition vouchers available to parents who choose not to send their children to private schools. And the federal government was interesting. In Washington, D.C. was one that had a voucher program, and that is anybody that wanted to send their kids to private school could take their state money, their state support with them to support that private school. And the current administration was elected. That was the first thing they stopped, was that voucher system. And even though the president's kids go to a private school in Washington, D.C., he stopped the voucher system so the other poor kids couldn't. So I thought that was interesting. Then there's homeschooling, and there isn't in this day and age. Even 10 years ago, this was unheard of. 20, nobody knew what this was. But today, none of you, every one of you, have heard of this. And it's just educating kids in the home. Children at home were those who lived far from school. It was impossible for children to attend. In the past several decades, however, a growing number of parents have been choosing to educate their children at home, at least through elementary grades, and sometimes even through high school. I have 2 nieces. My brother and his wife are homeschooling their 2 daughters, and they're basically the same age as my boys. They say when they get to high school age, they're going to send them to school, but at this point, they're still being homeschooled. Often it stems from a concern that children in the public schools may be exposed to problems such as drugs, alcohol, smoking, or gangs. Okay, and that could be, it goes on here, other parents have religious motives, and I think that's more common, want their children to be taught a particular religious content. Still, other parents may have had experiences with public schools, have had bad experiences, simply feel they can provide a better education for their children at home. Recent laws and court cases have generally helped upheld that right, within a certain parameters of parents that educate their children to do so. The number of parents providing homeschooling has grown each year in the last decades. Recent development among a minority of those who homeschool is a philosophy sometimes called unschooling, and this I haven't heard of, in which parents provide no instruction but allow their children to learn through whatever they naturally do. And as one would expect, there's many different perspectives on the value of homeschooling in our society. Now, I think and I've known not lots, but I would say more than 10 families that have homeschooled. And here's my take on it. Disagree, push back, spew if you want. But those kids were matured a lot quicker. My kids learned to talk about drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and not to adults. And most of the homeschool kids I've met, and now I've observed many of them in adult life, function much better because become very comfortable talking with adult subjects, things that are going on in life, and don't learn to talk about drugs, sex, and rock and roll, so they have a hard time. We get all cranked up about socialization. They're not socializing stuff, and which simply means they don't understand which drug there is and where to get them and how much they cost. And so I would consider myself a proponent of homeschooling. I think the federal government's going to come after them. I think the federal government's going to shut this down unless they comply with federal law and No Child Left Behind and those types of things. I think that, and the private schools. In fact, I think the private schools are going to write right away that unless they comply with Common Core standards, they're going to lose all kinds of funding or any involvement with the federal government. But the homeschoolers are in big trouble, because I don't think the feds are going to allow people to teach kids the way they want. They want the groupthink. They want everybody to do the same. They want them to understand drugs, sex, and rock and roll. And so this mass exodus is also a problem. And I think that'll continue to increase until they crack down on it. I think you'll see more exodus to private school and to homeschooling, just because of Common Core standards and the involvement of the federal government. And why I'm poo-pooing federal government involvement is now it's 10,000 miles up in the air away from us. If you've got a grievance or disagree, if you want to participate in your school, control of it is now in Washington, D.C., where it used to be in the state capitol building. Prior to that, it was in your local districts. You knew the people running the schools. You knew the board people. You could get to the people in your state, but you can't get to anybody in the federal government to impact it. And that's what they like about it. They can make laws, come up with stuff, and regulate your life, and never see you, never know you, and then exempt themselves from any involvement with their regulations. So, if they make sure you know unschooling. There's a question on the test about unschooling. And we're going to continuing adult education. And it has a number of things here. Existed centuries. First of all, the immigrants provided stuff for the new immigrants to this country to learn English. Was the first form of it, and of course it was done by schools and churches. Factories decided they had to do some safety training. That was adult ed. Churches taught a religious instruction. You can put any of this you want in the notes and so forth. Public schools develop extensive English language programs. Here it says Gary, Indiana designed adult vocational and technical training programs, developed rural agricultural education, if maybe some of you are involved with that. Vocational agriculture, or FFA, that was an outgrowth of that. Here's another federal piece of legislation. Funding to help adults learn to read and write. but just a number of adult things here. And then educational testing. Educators have undoubtedly attempted to measure the and assess student learning from the very beginning of formal education. Only the last 60 years have educational assessments taken on vast importance. May feel the assessment a proverbial tail that wags the dog. Educational, the